All right, I think we're just at about time here. Welcome everyone to this online workshop. This is best practices for documenting social science research data. My name is Maureen Haker, and I've been working with the UK Data Service for over 10 years now. I largely work with qualitative data, but I've worked on everything from ingesting our collections to reuse projects. And I'm going to be talking a little bit today on documentation for social science research data. So I'm going to be doing some talking today about documentation. There are a couple of exercises that we're going to go through to make this a little bit more interactive. I will try to monitor some of the questions that might come in during the second activity, but I may have to wait till the end of the workshop in order to be able to answer any further questions. This is an introductory workshop, so we're assuming that you may have had some research methods training, but we're aiming to try and really build a foundation of knowledge about research and collecting research materials and sharing research. So this is considered an introductory module. Okay, so this is a bit of an overview of what we're doing today. We'll start with the basics. What is documentation? Why is it important? Including some discussion on the FAIR principles. Some of you might already know FAIR. Some of you might have heard of it, but not really know much about it. So we'll just try and make sure that everyone's on the same page. And from there, we'll move to metadata or data about data, which is really what documentation is at its core. And then we'll move on to some examples of data level documentation, then study level documentation, with a distinction between common documentation for qualitative projects and documentation for quantitative projects. And throughout, again, I've had a couple of exercises to give you an opportunity to look at examples and think a little bit more about what kinds of documentation you can and should include with your project. So before we get started with me talking, though, we have our first activity. So Emma is facilitating today, and she's going to pop into the chat a couple of links for a worksheet. I will put the worksheet up on the screen in just a moment. But this quick activity is just to help you get thinking about the importance of documentation. So on the worksheet provided, you'll see that there's an interview extract, and you'll notice several things about that interview extract. I won't say too much there, but once you start reading it, you'll notice a few things. And what I'd like you to do as you're reading this short extract is guess what is the participant's age? And what year was the interview conducted? So, what age do you think the interviewee is? And what year do you think this interview took place? Give me a moment to kind of swap screens over. And Emma has already, oh, you've started posting some things, but she's going to pop the link to the activity in the chats. Let's see here. Okay, so when you get it, it should look like this. Okay, so you've just got a bit of data here without context. And while we're waiting on that, I'm just going to pop this up so you can start reading. And I'll give you about 5 minutes to have a read through. And then when you're ready, we can use the chat to try and see what some of the guesses are for the age and the year. You've had a bit of time to have a look at this. So can we start with the age of the interviewee? So, yeah, somebody has noticed the phonetic spelling of this transcript. So, phonetic spellings are a certain type of transcription that you can do. They're not very common, but in this particular example, we see it. And I think even those as an English native speaker probably may struggle with some of this as well. But it is quite telling. So we've got some guesses coming in. So a Scottish lady from the 70s or 80s, based on what she is referring to. Yeah, okay. So yeah, participant in her 80s. And we've got some guesses as well on the year the interview was taken. So the late 80s, possibly the 90s. Excellent. Okay, a lady from the 80s. Okay, any other guesses on how old she might be? Think she's in her 80s too. Yeah, it is hard to place when the interview might have been conducted. Could potentially change the way you feel about the interview. Participant in her 70s. Okay, so we've got a lot of guesses of those saying she's in her 70s, 80s, something like that. Let me just put up, Emma, if you want to go ahead and put up the documentation, I'm going to pop it up on the screen. This is a woman who is 43 years old, and the interview was conducted, I think the guesses on the interview weren't far off. So the interview was conducted in 1978, and she is indeed from Scotland. So yeah, there's a little bit more information if you wanted to read about grandmother 19 at age 43 being interviewed. So this particular research study I think is really interesting because you start reading the interview transcripts and we often have these preconceived ideas of what we expect people to be like. And I think often when we're confronted with some of the documentation, it says more about ourselves as a researcher and where we're coming from and what our assumptions and biases might be than it does about the research data itself. So if you had asked me without seeing the documentation, how old is the interviewee? Reading through some of the experiences she talked about, as well as just the context of this is grandmother 19, I would have also thought of my own grandmother, who, I would remember in my childhood her being in her maybe 60s, that I might have been a bit young for that, and 70s and later. So I think, some of these ideas, even when we have a small snippet, we need a bigger picture here. And this is where it's really useful to have clear documentation of your research project because you can explain this a little bit. You can also, for example, if you are going to use a phonetic translation like that, you can include a key that might help, that sort of thing. So documentation is actually really powerful. And I just want to go back briefly to the types of documentation that we're going to be covering in this workshop. So I mentioned the data level and the study level. So the study level is also sometimes called the project level documentation, which are the terms that are used by the UK Data Archive. So data level documentation provides information about data objects. So this could be variable information that's in a data file, or some sort of demographic details about a participant who is in an interview transcript. Study level documentation, however, is information about the broader research project. What methods were used, summaries of findings, when the research took place, etc. So when I asked you what's the interviewee's age, that's an example of data level documentation. And when I asked what is the year that the interview took place, that's an example of study level documentation. But those aren't the only terms that are used to describe documentation. So all this material from your research is called different things by different policies and places. So archives, like the UK Data Service, we'll call it documentation. And under documentation, we have specific kinds of documentation. So there's user guides, data lists, there's data dictionaries, and all of those we're going to talk about in this workshop. But there's also things like README files, which you may have been asked to write for us if you've ever deposited data with us. Some policies, like the ESRC's data policy, refer to research materials, which doesn't really have a specific definition as such, but rather it refers to anything that might have been used across the research project. It also refers to data assets, which is the system that is used to hold the data. And there's also metadata and the specific kind of brand name, if you like, kind of metadata like DDI. So DDI is a specific schema for metadata, and it gives you a distinct vocabulary to use when you're describing your data. While the concept of documentation is rather simple, the deeper you go and the deeper the deeper some of those ideas can run. So if you're interested in exploring some more of the terminology, CoData has a working group dedicated to terminology and guidance on terminology. Hopefully, the practical examples that I have and of the different types of documentation will give you enough of a flavor to really dive into any area that you want to know a little bit more about. Okay, so you know what it is and the different levels, and are hopefully starting to see how embedded these are into doing and disseminating research. So, why do we do it? Documentation, from the point of the archive, anyways, maximizes the reuse value of the data, and it's also essential for us to be able to review and publish data. You can't really understand data without the documentation. So if you just drop an interview transcript in the middle of the street and someone picks it up, they can't really understand the data without understanding the context in which it was gathered. This also adds to the historical value of the data, and it can build a provenance for it. So documentation allows you to expand on the methods and the processes that might not normally get covered in a publication. So there's endless space for documentation if you feel that something is useful for understanding the data. Whereas in those publications, you tend to get a much more sanitized version of what happened. And doing so can also enhance your research outputs. So documentation is an output in and itself, and documentation itself can be reused. And I'll come back to that later toward the end of the workshop. It also adds a level of transparency to research. So, as part of the peer review process, reviewers can better understand the work in the data, and reusers can also more accurately and efficiently reuse that data. And finally, it aids in the creation of fair research. So, I'll talk more about FAIR in just a moment, but I just want to do another quick exercise, which may highlight, for some of you anyways, some of the points that we've been thinking about in terms of why documentation is important. So let's just imagine for a moment, you're looking at the table here. Can you understand what the data represent? And we might be able to guess the meaning, but we need a little bit of extra information to help us understand and use that data. So by adding additional metadata, the table is suddenly transformed and the usability has dramatically increased. However, we are still missing some important pieces of contextual information. What's missing? What might help us make sense of this? Adding a little bit more detail about what some of those variables are, how they're measuring things. So additional metadata provides that further information about the units in which this numerical data are presented, and it makes the data even easier to interpret. Okay, so hopefully that's a clear demonstration between the interview and the table. Those are clear demonstrations of how context can matter and they can change your perception of data. But why share the documentation and data? And this particular point is one of the key underpinning principles of FAIR data. So FAIR principles are they're relatively new guidelines or goals of research, which aim to make research more transparent, collaborative, and constructive. So since about the early 2000s, technology has massively impacted the way that research is done. We can collect more data, which is more complex, and share it much quicker than we've ever been able to do before. However, despite collecting so much data all the time, we still have challenges in processing that data. So just think about any organization where data is not shared between departments. I'm sure we all have examples of that. And you have to constantly re-enter the same information again and again. So how do we solve this? Well, in 2016, Wilkinson et al. Published the FAIR principles, which outlined what good data management looked like that would enable the sharing and reuse of data. So the key here is to make data machine readable. So to be able to use the technology that we have that massively changed the way that research is done. And these guidelines were so influential that an international collaboration was established at the called the Go Fair International Support and Coordination Office just a year after that publication. And these FAIR principles continue to influence policies. So you'll see FAIR references in the data policies for the Research Data Alliance, the Association of European Research Libraries, UKRI, and all of its research councils. So if you receive grants or taxpayer money to complete your research, chances are you're going to be asked to share the data and documentation at the completion of the project. Many publishers are now also requiring the sharing of data and research materials before publication in the name of transparency and research rigor. This is part of the kind of new publishing guidelines of being rigorous and objective in their publications. So the FAIR principles state that data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So research is not just something that you complete in the solitude of an academic office, but it's something which is completed in collaboration with others and then shared for further reuse. So to make your data fair, it also means that you need to document your data. And to make data findable and accessible requires clear metadata. And equally, to make data reusable means documenting the provenance of that data. So I won't go further into the FAIR principles here. You can read a little bit more about it if you want to. But please do send any questions through that you might have using our Q&A box. So I'm happy to try and give any more detail if you're interested in it. However, I did want to point out something which spans across each of these FAIR principles, and that is metadata. So metadata is really at the root of what is documentation. It helps describe the data in our catalog pages. It helps describe participants. And it helps to describe methods. So there's a lot of grassroots work to build up what we call schemas of metadata to try and synchronize some of those descriptions. And we're going to expand a little bit more on metadata and introduce you to DDI. So metadata, we'll cover what it is, what qualifies as good metadata, what are some of the standards, and how it is produced. So we're starting here with metadata because all documentation, in a sense, is metadata. But what is metadata? The best definition of metadata that I've heard is that it is data about data. Essentially, it is information that describes and explains data. So usually when we talk about metadata, we're talking about standardized, structured information. And the idea behind the standardization is that it will be machine readable. So if you go onto our data catalog and start searching for data, our catalog is reading the standardized metadata on the catalog pages to help bring back appropriate results. And because metadata is what underpins the cataloging and the citing and discovering and retrieving of all of our data collections. So basically, you need metadata in order to find data collections. So good, complete metadata becomes very important for the reuse of data. Importantly, metadata should be collected and recorded throughout the research data lifecycle. It's not simply something that you should think about as you are depositing a data set or looking at reusing a data set. Instead, you should be thinking about each step of creating, preserving, and reusing data, thinking about what metadata is available and what metadata might enhance the collection. But what does metadata actually depict? All of this metadata aims to answer the kind of journalistic 5 Ws and 1 H of data. So who created the data? What does the data file contain? When were the data created? Where were the data created? Why were the data created? And how were the data created? So we have lots of examples of how this is done. But overall, the key question is, what would someone with no prior knowledge of the project or data need in order to be able to understand or use that data correctly in their own research? And some of the metadata we capture at the UKDS and on our catalog pages includes these fields. So there's an abstract, a set of keywords and topics, which in our catalog are based on standardized schema. So you search and select from a list of keywords and topics, the dates of field, the country, information about the sample, including, the observation or analytic unit, population, the number in your sample, and there's also information collected about the method and the kind of data and weighting where that's applicable. But if we are collecting this information or tacitly know this information about our own research, why have you said it needs to be structured? Well, structured metadata or metadata that is standardized and uses a schema to guide its description is really important. So by using that structured metadata, it helps to establish how one piece of information relates to the two other pieces of information and makes it easier for computers to automatically extract information from the metadata. So this is obviously helpful for archives, for us, looking to increase findability of our data collections, but it's also useful for researchers because it becomes a comparative to see how your research fits within the larger field. So it helps you find background literature or data to build context for your research questions. And this information provides context that might influence the decisions that you make in your analysis. So what are the metadata standards? Who decides what these are? A metadata standard provides a framework to establish a common set of characteristics or attributes of data. These are very standardized from the language to the spelling and the format. All of that is taken into account when setting these standards. So if everyone uses a different standard, it might make it difficult to find or compare data across different sources. So a metadata standard is a requirement which is intended to establish a common understanding of a meaning or semantics of that data to ensure, its correct and proper use, interpretation of the data by the owners and any other reusers. But there are different standards based on disciplinary differences. So consequently, sometimes it's necessary to kind of translate or use a translation program to map between these standards to allow for better findability. So metadata standards allow for data discovery and access, consequent reuse of the data, interoperability of systems. So being able to use data across different systems and programs and sharing of data and metadata between communities, whether those communities are data providers like archives like us and data users or reusers or just different types of data users. So there are a number of metadata schemas that can be used. However, for those who are doing research in social sciences specifically, DDI is the schema to understand best, and it's also what the UK Data Service uses to underpin our data catalog. So DDI is the Data Documentation Initiative, and it's a rich and detailed metadata standard which has been developed by the DDI Alliance. There's a couple of different versions of DDI. So the DDI codebook and the DDI lifecycle are the two to know. So the DDI codebook gathers more basic information and it's often used to describe collections at a higher level. So this is really useful for our data catalogs, for example. DDI lifecycle, on the other hand, is a little bit more complex and it allows you to describe survey questions and variables in addition to the basic catalog information. So DDI lifecycle might be particularly useful if you're looking at longitudinal studies where similar questions or variables might be reused across different survey waves. It allows for you to be able to identify and compare responses on the same variable. So just to point out, there are a lot of different types of metadata standards and schemas. Some have very specific uses. You can use more than one standard to help you describe data, and you might also be able to map or translate, as I said before, across different standards. If I can get this scrolling. I can't find, oh, there it goes, there it goes. Oh, I think I have to hover above it. Okay, so if you're planning to archive data, you will need to provide metadata to describe it. So this is usually gathered by a form that you log into our system and you're confronted with this kind of standardized form where you add information about your data and its provenance. So behind that form, the information is categorized into metadata elements that construct the catalog record for your data. So the UK Data Service Catalog uses the DDI metadata elements. So our records contain some mandatory and some optional metadata elements, including the study description. So that's information about the context of the data collection. So that is things like the bibliographic citation of the study and data, the scope of the study. So we've got a section on topics and geography and time, the methodology or the data collection, and that will include information about sampling and processing. We also have data access information and information on accompanying materials. We also have data file descriptions. So this is information about, the data format, the file type, the file structure, any missing data or weighting variables, any software that might be needed. There's also variable descriptions and keywords. So it's really good practice to use a thesaurus, a specific thesaurus, when you're picking out your keywords. So we use the European Language Social Science thesaurus. There are some multilingual thesauruses for the social sciences as well. It is worth considering how you describe and share your metadata as openly as possible. So using the FAIR principles can help with that. And other tools such as metadata profiles are also available to help you decide on the important metadata elements to include when you're describing your study. In addition to the DDI structure of the metadata for our catalog pages, we also subscribe to controlled vocabularies. So you'll notice on the catalog pages that we have those topics and keywords that you can use to search for related data. These are not just free text fields. They come from controlled vocabularies. So the UK Data Archive is the guardian of the humanities and social science electronic thesaurus, and the multilingual version, the European Language Social Science thesaurus. There are a number of these vocabularies, which are usually, again, discipline specific. And we've got another activity here to give you an opportunity to search through some different controlled vocabulary. So what I'd like you to do is go to bartalk.org and enter in some search words on your particular field of study or research and see what kind of controlled vocabularies come up for your discipline. So if you give me just a moment, I'm going to swap screens around and you can see here we are. You can do any kind of search that you want. So my background is in sociology, and you can see that there's a list of sociology vocabularies that come up. And if you I'm just clicked on the first one, and you can see there's a home page for this particular vocabulary. So I've gone ahead and gone to that, and you can see here the listing. There's a little bit of metadata here about the vocabulary itself. You can see how many terms are in it. And you can kind of search through what kind of terms are frequently used. So you can do a comparison between different fields if you're interested in comparing vocabularies, or if you just want to know what kinds of vocabularies are in your particular field. But I'll give you just a few minutes, another 5 minutes here, just to have a little search and play around with Bartalk and see what kinds of vocabularies you find. Someone's just said in the chat that nothing is coming up. I just had to go with it before. Let me just swap my screen again. It could be perhaps your search term. It might be worth checking other terms. Yeah, it should. And then the home page is where you would want to go to actually see what that particular vocabulary looks like, right? So the home page of that. So this is just like an index, if you will, It's a catalog of different vocabularies. So if nothing's come up, it might be worth trying some different terminology. Someone said they tried homelessness. You want to try for your discipline. So rather than looking for a specific word as such, that might be in the vocabulary. You want to try for a vocabulary of sociological terms, psychological terms, psychoanalytic terms, so on and so forth. So try, searching for a specific discipline. If it's not coming up with something for that particular search term, try a related discipline. And then once you get there, it should have any information that it has on the home page for that particular vocabulary will be there. So if the link isn't working itself, hopefully the link will take you if you just copy paste it. Otherwise, I would say try a different vocabulary just to see what kinds of words are coming up for that particular discipline. I'll give you just another minute to keep having a play around. If there are any other issues, pop them in the chat and we'll see if we can troubleshoot. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on, but do feel free to keep having a play around there. Hopefully, those of you who had some issues have got it working now. Okay, so next we're going to look at data level documentation. So I'll give a quick overview, and then I am going to try and focus in on some of the key considerations for survey type data, as well as key considerations for qualitative data. So data level documentation is all about the specific data files within your collection. So this relates not to the whole collection, but to specific data files, which could be, for example, a single interview transcript, an SPSS file, or a single image. Often this kind of metadata is embedded within the file, and sometimes you collect that information as a standard part of the data collection. In survey data, data level documentation tends to be very structured, and if you're using programs like SPSS, the software is designed for you to add that metadata in even before you begin analysis. The metadata then becomes embedded within that data. For variable names, there needs to be a question number system which matches the questions in the questionnaire. Or if there's a numerical system that's used, it should be clear what the system is that's being used and how it relates to the questionnaire and the variable names. So these need to relate to each other somehow. We should have meaningful abbreviations, such as GOR for Government Office Region. There should be consistency in naming conventions across the entire project, especially where there's different data sets across the project. Finally, interoperability across platforms. Variables should be no longer than 8 characters and without spaces. Generally speaking, I think the kinds of software programs that you use for analysis for survey data are a little bit better with interoperability than, for example, with qualitative software programs, but just kind of be aware of some of those limitations, like the 8 characters and spaces. Following the similar principles for variable names, the variable labels should be brief and concise, so no more than 80 characters. Where applicable, they should use a unit of measurement. Again, if applicable, describe the coding or classification scheme used, including a reference. So for example, the Standard Occupation Classification 2000, SOC 2000, could be used. Finally, include a reference to the question in the survey or questionnaire. The example here does all of that. So Q9B hex W is the given label for the Q9B hours spent taking physical exercise in a typical week. So this label clearly includes the unit of measurement and a reference to the question. Not only does this make it easier for reusers, but I expect it would probably make it easier during your analysis as well. You should add value labels as well. Make sure there's no out of bound value labels for categorical variables. Avoid having blanks or zeros and instead label your missing data with detail where possible, differentiating what's not recorded, not provided, not applicable, not known, etc. So have a few different reasons for missing values. So here's an example of an SPSS variable view, which shows the variable name. You can see the label here, as well as the measurement and the missing values. And here are the variable values, which include missing information. With transcripts, data level documentation is usually included at the start of each interview. For those that are curated by the UK Data Archive, you'll see this kind of information at the beginning of each interview. So we've got the collection, the principal investigator, and some basic demographic details about the participant, including, for example, it might have their sex, their socioeconomic status, and the region that they're from. And these details can vary depending on what characteristics are deemed important or influential to the study. Images similarly will have some metadata about the image itself. We don't have many collections with images. There's lingering issues around, personal data, anonymization, etc., of how to deal with some of these images, or image data, I should say. And that does impact the usefulness of the image. However, we do have a few collections, including these images with our Edwardians collection. And in these, we usually included a caption which describes the photo itself, including anything notable in the image. You might also include some historical notes to help contextualize that image. And you can also record characteristics like region or the year it was taken or who it was taken by. And all of that would be really useful metadata to help make sense of that image at a later date. Okay, so study project level documentation provides high-level documentation on the research context and design, any data collection methods that are used, any data preparation and manipulations, plus some summaries of findings that are based on the data. So user guides are a key piece of documentation that sit alongside data collections and include further information about methods and field work. It includes all of this information together, and it's available openly. So you don't need to register in order to be able to view the user guides. Looking at the user guide alone, you will probably be able to start unpicking the intricacies of that collection. Rather than being embedded with the data, like the previous examples of data level documentation, user guides sit as a separate document. So user guides look different across different collections. There's no specific template as such, but rather it's tailored to what information is available and what the specifics are of that collection. So I won't go through the 3 user guides that are listed here, but the slides are going to be made available after we finish up here, so feel free to explore those. There are 3 very different examples of user guides and kind of give you a taste for what they could look like. Within collections that are curated by the UK Data Archive, these materials would be collated into a user guide. The user guide is then bookmarked. As you can see in the upper right corner of this screenshot, there's some bookmarks there that tell you what materials are available. These tend to encompass all of the project level documentation. While the collections curated by the UK Data Archive have user guides, you are more likely to see a folder of documents or separate files on collections that are deposited by the researchers themselves. So we kind of have a dual system working within the UK Data Archive where you can deposit yourself and prepare your own data through our reshare deposit system. Or sometimes we are given data or we work with researchers, depending on the situation, to curate their data, in which case we would create a single file called a user guide. This user guide is an example from a survey. So you can see the bookmarks of this information that's provided on the right there, and it basically acts as a map to talk you through the preparation and delivery of the survey, as well as any other information that you might need to know. So here's further information about the sample, the questionnaire, the data structure, and even how to cite that user guide. In addition to what you saw in that example, other key documentation for surveys include things like technical reports, information leaflets and protocols, blank questionnaires with code books and survey instructions, coding frames, and any information about known errors or issues with the data. Qualitative collections also have user guides like the one that you see here, but this time the bookmarks are shown on the left-hand side. So this one shows an interview topic guide along with the final report that was done for the project and a blank consent form. And there's a little bit more information about the sample. And here's some examples of documentation for qualitative work. Basically, all the information that you probably create along the way of doing research, but which is never seen outside of the research team and maybe participants. So it can include interview preparation, including instructions to interviewers, prompts or topic guides, blank consent forms, information sheets, or any other materials that the participant received prior to taking part. It could also be text that is written by you, expanding on the methodology or sampling, including where it might be permissible under certain copyright restrictions, any extracts from publications or draft work that you made for a publication. What we don't see often, but that can be really useful, is things like research meeting minutes, research diaries or field notes, and documentation from analysis, including memos and code books or initial analysis write-ups. In the, we're over 1,500 collections of qualitative research at the moment. And overall, we really just don't see things related to documentation of the analysis. And I'm not sure why it's not part of the documentation. So this is really standard thing to include for quantitative collections, right? You would have your syntax or your code that would explain how you did your analysis of the data. But that analytic transparency, can really help to validate research findings, and it can help reusers to better understand some of the decisions that were made or not made about the cleaning and processing of that data. And this kind of context is actually really, really important for qualitative work. This is part of, what the argument is for doing things qualitatively, is that context matters, those interpretations and decisions matter, that you need to better understand that context. So hopefully these materials are being actively considered, by the research team during the data collection and analysis. Collating them and making them available as documentation then really helps the archive, and I think it really helps achieve what it is that qualitative work aims to achieve. But yeah, if you were to look through examples of qualitative documentation, you probably won't see very many of these kind of last bullet points listed here. Rather than being collated into a single document of a user guide, again, just like quantitative, sometimes that documentation remains separated into different documents. So you can see the example here from anti-politics collection that they've got all of this was a mixed methods study, and they've got all the different resources that they used, and they're all in a separate kind of file. You can collate them into a PDF, but this was deposited through our self-deposit reshare system, and they kept them as separate. As an alternative to embedded metadata, you might also have this information in a structured document altogether, so in code books or data dictionaries. And this should, contain the detailed and sufficient information about all of those data items, including the variables, new and derived, frequencies, command files that are used to create derived variables. We also have code book creation tools. We have the DDI editor, which is aimed at data processing for curation purposes. So this can be used prior to depositing your collection in the archive. We also have Nestar publisher. So there's a lot of existing information on these and how they can be used. So please do check the link for further information about these. And just having another look now at code books, you can see that this one from the Understanding Society teaching datasets, pictured here, you can see the variable name, the label, and where applicable options for responses and or the range of responses. Unlike the embedded metadata that was shown earlier, this code book can sit separately and therefore can also remain open, so that you wouldn't need to register in order to view it. Data dictionaries, very similar to code books, and often those terms are used interchangeably, can also sit within the study level documentation. Often the data dictionary, however, is going to contain more information about the structure of the database. So you can see here they've documented that the variable is numeric and scale level variable. And in addition to the user guide, the UK Data Archive also curates a data list for qualitative collections, which is this kind of at a glance look at participants. So this would, I mean, in some ways, this would probably be considered more of a data level documentation, like similar to the idea of like the code books and the data dictionaries, where you have this kind of basic metadata, these demographic details about each participant and the file name where you can find that relevant data. The details on these data lists are not always standardized or all-encompassing. So it's the details that were relevant to the project itself. These are things that are made by the principal investigator, so often they're made with their particular research questions in mind. They do take a little bit of time to assemble, but they are really useful organizational tools as well during research. So it's generally a good practice to create one as you go along. And again, this is a kind of documentation that would sit separately from the user guide and the data itself. You can make it, it's normally openly available. So you may want to think about what variables that you're going to include, what kind of details you would include on a data list. Other types of documentation include things like observations that are written by researchers in the moment of data gathering. Some types of methods dictate taking time for self-reflection as part of that method, and this may even be used as data. Others recommend that this is just a good practice. So these comments pictured here are just a few sentences that are written after every interview by the interviewers of a collection called Affluent Worker. And Affluent Worker is a seminal piece of research that was used to basically create the Office for National Statistics categories of social class. So they help to contextualize the relationship between the researcher and the participant, and they're really helpful data level documentation. This kind of documentation is a bit unusual. So I don't know if it's that people don't often use the kind of methods that don't dictate this kind of quick reflection, or if it's just not something that's often shared. But this kind of thing is really, really helpful to understand the power dynamics of the data collection. A step further than field notes are to actually look at some of the draft work of the analysis. So this is an example from Dennis Marsden's Mothers Alone collection. So he had this piece that he titled Felt Poverty, which never made it to publication, but it included documentation of, it was included with the documentation for this particular collection. And it is a really interesting collection. So the research was led by white, educated men who were interviewing single mothers living on welfare in the 1970s. And this piece really provides the context to show the sympathy that the research team felt toward the participants. So I think if you were to try and contextualize this research project, just knowing what we know about gender dynamics of the 1970s, you might not think that the research team truly understood their participants, but then you read this kind of initial analysis, which again never made it to publication, and it makes you feel differently about the research team. Annette Lawson's study, titled Adultery: An Analysis of Love and Betrayal, was a project that was conducted in the 1980s, aiming to explore the extremely taboo topic, for the time anyways, of adultery. So, as such, she found it really hard to recruit participants. People didn't want to talk about this. So, Lawson chose to put out a call for participants in a newspaper, but it created an arguably biased sample of mostly white, middle-class women who were responding to her call for participants. So, as such, Lawson became a bit preoccupied with her sample, and she wrote a 54-page defense of her sample. So, she starts here with a discussion about some of the ethical conundrums that arose from her sampling strategy, including jealous partners sending information of their married partners to participate, or another man who called from a psychiatric ward. And she then had an extensive comparison between her sample and the national population. So, exploring what significant differences from the national population her sample was, and whether that would actually affect her data. And finally, she comes to some really interesting conclusions about sampling strategies more broadly, including this point here that sampling needs to match the context of the study, and that exploratory studies are benefited from a greater focus on the ability to talk about the topic in detail rather than this kind of infatuation with the profile of the participants themselves. So this entire kind of 54 pages that she had written, again, just like Dennis Morrison's work, never actually made it to publication, but all of it is included with the documentation of her data, which is a mixed method study. So there's questionnaires as well as focus groups and interviews. And this serves as the documentation for that collection. Earlier, I had an example of just a few interviewer notes that was written after an interview, but field notes are another example of very detailed documentation. Field notes are a little bit different in that I think they occupy this kind of gray space of being both data and documentation at different times. So it's worth pointing out that documentation is something that is normally openly available unless it's embedded in the data, but it would normally be openly available. So field notes and other reflections, depending on the level of detail, may need to be put behind access restrictions that match the data itself. There's only, I'd say there's only about a half a dozen collections with examples of field notes, and almost all of those are ethnographic studies. But it is another kind of documentation that you might consider putting into your user guide. And there are new possibilities with changing technology, and Vivo and other computer-assisted qualitative analysis software will allow you to download your codebooks, your memos, your mind maps. And here you can see a list of nodes and their descriptions. All is easily downloadable as a PDF, and a couple other formats. When we received, for example, the Edwardians collection, which is our founding collection for our qualitative part of our archive, that collection contains 453 80-plus page interviews with British residents who were born during the Edwardian period. And it was accompanied by all of the analysis work done by hand. So basically, this list of nodes and their descriptions, we had all of that work for this collection, but done by hand. So it was 16 shelves that we had to dedicate to holding the coding of those transcripts into these key themes. And now we can download all of that as a single file at any point, during or after our coding is done. Research teams also use blogs and websites to keep in touch with participants. So if you keep a research blog, which updates others on the, progress of the research, or if it posts information for participants, or even sends out calls for participants, you can link that in the additional resources for your collection. So once the project is done, that site then can kind of sit alongside the project, providing that additional documentation of the process. We do also see some more creative documentation too, such as this photo story. Again, this sort of thing can be classed as either documentation or potentially data. But there is some scope here to use video and audio files to accompany the data. Again, there may need to be some considerations there of anonymization, and whether or not it's appropriate to release certain kinds of audio or visual data. But that is something that can be done as well. And finally, changing technology is not just for how research is done, but also how we archive. So the UK Data Service has created QualiBank, which is an online tool for searching and browsing and citing qualitative data. So as part of that tool, you can search and view qualitative data online and also view the linked documentation. So this documentation can relate to the specific data or the collection as a whole, but it allows for the distinction between project level and data level documentation. And in addition to the user guides and related resources, we also, of course, have the README file. So this file usually contains information about how the data was prepared for ingest into the archive. Within the archive, this file can be automatically generated and edited, but it's really important that you write some kind of README file for your data files. So um, just quickly, some concluding remarks. Just about reusing documentation and a data sharing checklist, some mandatory documentation. So a point about reusing documentation, I think often we think about the reuse value of the data specifically and less about how documentation has its own value. Documentation can serve as an inspiration for good practices. So, for example, adapting consent forms or survey briefs or information sheets rather than writing them from scratch can be really useful. We have hundreds of consent forms documented within our collection, including snippets like the ones that you see here or here. Explaining what data sharing means, what kind of outputs they're going to create, how the data is going to be used. So please do explore that documentation and learn about some of the good practices that have been done in research. And you can do the same with data collection. So one collection. So this is an example from the Pioneers of Social Research, but we've got another collection that comes to mind is the foot and mouth disease in North Cumbria. And they deposited their interview guide. So it looked a bit kind of like this kind of interview guide. And those were reused by medical students to better understand doctor-patient dynamics and how to construct and kind of navigate through an interview with a patient. I do also refer my own dissertation students to find similar interview guides before setting off and making one themselves, or to look at questionnaires that have been deposited and see how questions were asked, so they can see what's important to ask, what might not be as important to ask, and how to structure an interview quite generally. So again, we have hundreds of these kinds of interview guides and questionnaires to kind of look through and see what some of those good practices are. And you can also examine how to do research with children and vulnerable groups. So writing up information letters and consent forms for children specifically is especially difficult, but we do have a few novel collections which I think provide really good examples of how this has been produced in the past, how it's been formatted, and what kind of information was included. And then we have this data sharing checklist, some mandatory documentation. So if you are going to share your data with us, there are a few bits of documentation that's absolutely essential. There are templates for everything that you would need to write. So if you need a template for example, a data list or a README file, you can just download those and adapt them to your own projects. You will be asked to fill in a data offer and or data deposit form with as much detail as possible. And again, those are going to use those standardized metadata schemas. So the language that you use may be coming from a controlled vocabulary, or you may have some drop-down menus that you have to choose from. And that just allows us as an archive to create machine-readable metadata about your data. You want to also ensure that your data files contain data level documentation. So as part of our review process for the data collection, we're going to make sure that there is some embedded data level documentation as well, and you'll be asked to fill that in if there isn't any. We also have loads of tools and templates available, so I've hyperlinked some of them here, but you can find them in our Learning Hub as well on our website. And this includes things like consent forms, transcription templates, transcription instructions, a transcription confidentiality agreement, data list templates. All of these can just be downloaded and reused and adapted for your own project. And we've got further resources as well. So if you're interested in a little bit more about data management, we have hundreds of pages on our Learning Hub that kind of expand on some of the issues around data management. CESDA is a consortium for the European Social Science and Data Archives. They also have a data management expert guide, which is really useful. We've got our own managing and sharing data best practices for researchers. So we have a book out, and you can view the first edition of that on that PDF link. Closer, some of you who do longitudinal or work with longitudinal survey data will know Closer. But they've got a publication as well, Understanding Metadata. And then if you are interested in learning a little bit more about the FAIR principles, you can check out the Go FAIR website. So this is just an image of our own data management guide. So it's on its second edition. And that is something that you can order if you want to. We also offer regular training that covers a lot of the issues that are raised within this guide. And the training is regularly updated. Because we're at the end of the academic year, we're kind of coming to a close on the round of training events that we have at the moment, but those are going to be, we're going to have a new schedule with the new academic term. I think there's a couple that are still left. If you're interested, do check out our events page. But we will, if you check back at the start of the academic term, we'll have a new listing and we every term will update that. So do check out some of our upcoming events. And then you can connect with us as well using the usual kind of connection. So we've got a YouTube channel. We're on Twitter, X, whatever it's called now. We have Gmail, and then of course our website. So the evaluation link will come up when you leave the workshop. So I think we'll probably be wrapping up here and closing it down anyways, but you'll get a pop-up screen of a survey. And it hopefully doesn't take too long. I know there are some open text fields on it, so but it's just a few questions. Thank you so much, everyone. I think we'll wrap up here and hopefully we'll see you at some future events. And I hope this has been useful. And yeah, we'll speak to you soon. If you do have any more questions, feel free to pop me an email or get in touch with the UK Data Service, and we can try and get you some answers. Have a good day, everyone.